Before history learned to write in full sentences, before chronicles flowed smoothly from king to king, there came a storm that shattered the ancient world. It did not announce itself with a single name, a single banner, or a single homeland. It arrived instead as terror, as fire on the horizon, as ships cutting through the waves with unfamiliar prows. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. And in doing so, they captured not who they were, but how they came from the sea. Sudden and overwhelming, like a tide that could not be held back. To understand who the Sea Peoples were, we must first understand the world they destroyed. Around the year 1300 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was a tightly connected system of powerful states. Egypt ruled the Nile Valley and projected its influence northward. The Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia. Mycenaean kingdoms thrived in Greece. City-states like Ugarit, Byblos, and Tyre acted as hubs of trade and diplomacy. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant lands, gold from Nubia, timber from Lebanon all flowed along maritime and overland routes. Kings wrote to one another as equals, calling each other brother. This was not a primitive world stumbling in the dark. It was a globalized Bronze Age civilization, sophisticated, literate, and interconnected. But such a system was fragile. It depended on constant movement, ships arriving on time, harvests succeeding, alliances holding. When pressure came, it did not come in isolation. It came as collapse. The Sea Peoples emerged from this moment not as a single invading nation, but as a symptom of a world unraveling. Our knowledge of them comes almost entirely from the records of those who survived their onslaught, particularly the Egyptians. In the temples and inscriptions of pharaohs like Merneptah and Ramesses III, we see their names carved into stone. The Sherdon, the Shekelesh, the Luka, the Peliset, the Denyen, the Tiakur, the Weshesh. These names are echoes, distorted through foreign tongues, preserved by enemies who feared them. Egyptian reliefs show them wearing horned helmets, round shields slung over their shoulders, long swords raised high. Their ships are crowded with warriors, women, and children, suggesting not mere raiders, but migrating people's entire communities on the move. This detail is crucial. The Sea Peoples were not simply pirates. They were displaced populations searching for new lands, driven by forces that historians still debate. One theory points north, toward the Aegean world. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece collapsed around the same time. Cities like Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns were destroyed or abandoned. Linear B tablets record desperate last inventories before the fires came. It is possible that some of the Sea Peoples were Mycenaeans themselves, uprooted by internal strife, earthquakes, or economic failure, turning outward in search of survival. Another theory looks to Anatolia and the western coast of modern Turkey. The Luka, for instance, may have come from Lycia, a region long associated with seafaring and rebellion against imperial control. The Hittite Empire, once a superpower, collapsed catastrophically around 1200 BCE. Its capital, Hattusa, was burned and abandoned. Refugees from this implosion may have poured southward, taking to the sea when land routes failed. Climate may also have played a decisive role. Evidence from pollen records and lake sediments suggests a period of prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean. Crops failed. Famine spread. Letters from Ugarit speak of hunger and desperation. In such conditions, entire societies could fracture, pushing people to migrate en masse. The Sea Peoples may have been the human face of environmental catastrophe, yet none of this fully explains their effectiveness. What made the Sea Peoples so devastating was not just their movement, but their way of war. Bronze Age armies were elite forces, chariots, aristocratic warriors, tightly controlled by kings. The Sea Peoples, by contrast, appear to have fought as infantry, heavily armed and adaptable. Their longswords, possibly early iron weapons, gave them an edge over chariot-based forces on broken terrain. They did not fight for territory in the traditional sense. They overwhelmed systems, toppled cities, and moved on. Ugarit provides one of the clearest snapshots of this terror. In its final days, the city sent frantic letters to allies, begging for help. One message reads, "The enemy ships are here. My cities are burned. My troops are in the land of Hatti." No help ever came. Ugarit was destroyed, never to rise again. Cyprus fell soon after. So did cities along the Levantine coast. The trade networks that sustained the Bronze Age snapped. Without tin, bronze could not be made. Without bronze, armies could not be equipped. Without armies, kings lost control. One collapse triggered another, cascading across the region like falling dominoes. Only Egypt stood firm, and even Egypt barely survived. During the reign of Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples launched a massive assault by land and sea. Egyptian reliefs show the climactic battle in the Nile Delta. Egyptian archers line the shores, firing volleys into tightly packed enemy ships. The sea churns with bodies and wreckage. On land, Egyptian chariots clash with migrating families, their ox carts piled high with belongings. Ramesses III claims total victory. He boasts that the Sea Peoples were laid low and slain, their plans crushed forever. But the truth is more complex. Egypt survived, yes, but it emerged weakened. Its economy strained, its borders tightened, its imperial ambitions faded. And some of the Sea Peoples did not disappear. The Peliset, widely identified with the Philistines, settled along the southern coast of Canaan. Archaeology reveals a sudden appearance of Aegean-style pottery, architecture, and foodways in cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. These were not conquerors ruling from afar. They were settlers, building new identities from old fragments. In the biblical narrative, they would later become enduring rivals of the Israelites, remembered as giants and warriors, but originally born from the same age of collapse. Other groups may have merged into local populations, their names fading but their influence lingering. The Shurden appear in Egyptian records not only as enemies, but later as mercenaries in Pharaoh's own army. Once feared invaders, they became hired soldiers absorbed rather than annihilated. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the Sea Peoples. They were not an alien force from beyond history. They were part of it. They were the product of systemic failure, of climate stress, economic interdependence, political rigidity, and social inequality. When the old order could no longer sustain itself, people moved. And when people moved, the world changed. The Bronze Age collapse was not the end of civilization, but a transformation. From its ashes rose a new era, the Iron Age, marked by smaller states, new technologies, and different forms of power. Writing disappeared in some regions, only to return centuries later. Kings were no longer gods among men, but rulers of fractured lands. The Sea Peoples stand at the threshold of this transformation. They were both destroyers and creators. They ended one world and helped shape another. So who were the Sea Peoples? They were sailors and soldiers, refugees and raiders. They were Mycenaeans without palaces, Anatolians without kings, farmers without rain. They were families fleeing hunger, warriors seeking survival, cultures colliding in motion. They were not one people, but many, united not by blood, but by circumstance. And in their wake, they left one of history's greatest silences, a dark age, not because nothing happened, but because so much was lost that memory itself broke apart. Yet even in that silence, their legacy endures. In the ruins of burned cities, in the genetic and cultural traces along the Mediterranean coast, in the lesson that no civilization, no matter how advanced, is immune to collapse when its foundations are stretched beyond their limits. The Sea Peoples did not ask to be remembered. They did not leave epics, in their own words, but they reshaped history all the same, not as villains from the deep, but as the human tide that rose when the world they knew could no longer hold them. And yet, even this is only the beginning of their story. Because when we speak of the Sea Peoples, We often imagine a single moment, a sudden catastrophe, around 1200 BCE. But the reality stretches far wider, deeper, and longer. The Sea Peoples were not a single wave. They were a series of movements, eruptions, and aftershocks that unfolded over generations. To truly understand them, we must linger in the ruins they left behind and listen carefully to what silence, archaeology, and fragmentary texts still whisper. After the fall of the great Bronze Age powers, the Mediterranean did not immediately stabilize. Instead, it entered a prolonged period of fragmentation. Trade routes that once connected distant kingdoms vanished. Literacy disappeared in places like Greece for centuries. Cities shrank or were abandoned altogether. This was not merely destruction, it was disconnection, and the Sea Peoples were both agents and products of this disconnection. One of the most haunting aspects of the Sea Peoples is that they left almost no written record of their own. Everything we know about them comes through the fearful eyes of their enemies. Egyptian inscriptions describe them as chaotic, lawless, and innumerable. Yet archaeology tells a more nuanced story. Where the Sea Peoples settled, we often see continuity alongside change. They did not simply burn and move on. In many places, they adapted, rebuilt, and integrated. Take the Philistines once more. Early Philistine cities show a blend of Aegean and Levantine traditions. Their pottery initially mirrors Mycenaean styles, but over time it becomes distinctly local. Their diet includes pork at higher rates than neighboring cultures, hinting at different customs. Their architecture shifts from foreign to familiar. This is not the story of conquerors imposing dominance. It is the story of migrants reshaping themselves to survive. This pattern suggests that the Sea Peoples were not united by ideology or leadership. There was no single king of the Sea Peoples, no capital, no homeland to return to. Instead, they were bound by motion. Movement itself became their identity. In a collapsing world, stability was no longer found in cities or borders, but in adaptability. Egyptian reliefs show something else that challenges the old narrative. Women and children appear alongside warriors, traveling in ox-drawn carts. This detail cannot be overstated. Armies do not bring families into battle. Migrations do. The Sea Peoples were not launching campaigns of conquest in the modern sense. They were attempting to relocate entire societies. Why relocate by sea? Because the land routes were no longer safe. Inland Anatolia was collapsing. The Hittite road networks were gone. Banditry, famine, and political vacuum made overland travel deadly. The sea, once a channel of commerce, became a last refuge. Ships became lifeboats for civilizations in freefall, and these ships were not crude vessels. Bronze Age seafaring was highly advanced. Mariners could navigate by stars, currents, and coastlines. They carried livestock, tools, and weapons. The Sea Peoples did not stumble blindly across the Mediterranean. They moved with intention, guided by generations of maritime knowledge. This helps explain their sudden appearance across vast distances. From the Aegean to Cyprus, from Anatolia to the Levant, similar destruction layers appear within decades of each other. This synchronicity was once puzzling. Now it appears inevitable. A networked world collapsed in a networked way. Still, one question lingers above all others. Why were the Sea Peoples so successful? The answer lies not just in their weapons, but in timing. The Great Bronze Age states were already weakened. Chariot warfare dominated elite military strategy, but chariots were expensive, fragile, and dependent on infrastructure. Roads, stables, trained horses, and centralized authority were all required. When these systems began to fail, chariots became liabilities rather than advantages. The Sea Peoples fought differently. Their infantry-based tactics thrived in chaos. They did not need roads. Right now, they did not need roads. They did not rely on aristocratic command structures. They fought with longswords, spears, and shields, weapons suited for close combat and adaptable terrain. Against fractured states, this flexibility was devastating. Moreover, many sea peoples may have once served within the very armies they later defeated. Mercenaries were common in the Late Bronze Age. Soldiers moved between kingdoms. Military knowledge traveled with them. The collapse may have turned former defenders into attackers, men trained by empires that could no longer pay or protect them. This blurring of lines between soldier, refugee, and raider makes the sea peoples difficult to categorize, and that discomfort is telling. History prefers clear labels. The sea peoples refuse them. Even the famous Egyptian victory under Ramesses III reveals cracks in imperial confidence. Tomb robberies increased. Labor strikes erupted at Deir el-Medina, the first recorded labor strike in history. Egypt survived, but it did not thrive. The age of empire was ending. In the centuries that followed, the memory of the sea peoples faded into legend. In Greek tradition, tales of wandering heroes, returning warriors, and lost homelands echo the trauma of displacement. The Trojan War myths, though embellished, may preserve distant memories of the same upheavals. The idea of heroes without homes, fighting over ruined cities, resonates deeply with the archaeology of the collapse. And yet, life continued. From the ashes of the Bronze Age emerged new forms of society. Small kingdoms replaced empires. Iron replaced bronze, cheaper, more accessible, and transformative. Power decentralized. Local identities strengthened. The world became less interconnected, but more resilient in its fragmentation. In this sense, the sea peoples were midwives of a new era. They did not intend to end the Bronze Age. They did not plan the collapse of empires. They were responding to forces beyond their control: drought, famine, inequality, and systemic fragility. But their movement accelerated what was already underway. They pushed a failing system past the point of recovery. This is why modern historians no longer ask whether the sea peoples were villains or heroes. That question misses the point. The sea peoples were a mirror. They reflected the weaknesses of the world they encountered. Where societies were rigid, they broke. Where systems depended on constant growth and stability, they failed. And this is why the sea peoples still matter. They remind us that collapse is rarely caused by a single enemy. It comes from within, through overextension, environmental strain, and social imbalance. External shocks merely reveal what was already unstable. The sea peoples were not the end of civilization. They were the end of a particular way of organizing it. They were the sound of borders dissolving, of identities in motion, of people refusing to disappear quietly. They were humanity under pressure, choosing movement over extinction, and perhaps that is why their story still unsettles us. Because in every age of crisis, the question returns not as myth, but as reality. When systems fail, when climates shift, when people are forced to move, who will history call the sea peoples next? To continue this story, we must slow down even further and step into the centuries that followed the first shockwaves of the sea peoples' arrival. Because collapse is never a single moment. It is a long twilight. And in that twilight, the sea peoples did not vanish. They transformed. In the aftermath of destruction, the Eastern Mediterranean became a mosaic of survivors. Cities that once answered to great kings now stood alone, ruled by local strongmen, councils, or warlords. In this fractured world, the descendants of the sea peoples blended into the landscape. Their names faded, but their presence did not. Along the Levantine coast, new coastal polities emerged that relied more heavily on maritime trade than their Bronze Age predecessors. Shipbuilding improved. The sea, once a highway between empires, became the lifeline of smaller, more flexible societies. This maritime shift bears the fingerprints of peoples who had lived, fought, and migrated by water. In Greece, the collapse ushered in what historians once called the Dark Age. But darkness is a misleading word. What disappeared was centralized power, monumental architecture, and widespread literacy. What emerged instead were village-based societies, oral traditions, and new social bonds. Memory replaced record. Story replaced inscription. And within those stories, echoes of wandering, exile, and return are everywhere. Heroes like Odysseus are not kings in stable realms. They are survivors of a shattered world, drifting from shore to shore, encountering hostile coasts and unfamiliar peoples. These myths did not arise in a vacuum. They reflect collective memory, a cultural processing of generations of displacement that began with the same forces that produced the sea peoples. Even warfare itself changed. The age of chariots ended. Infantry became dominant. Weapons were simpler, cheaper, and more widely available. Iron spread not because it was initially superior, but because it was abundant. This democratization of violence reshaped society. Power no longer belonged exclusively to palace elites. It spread outward, downward, into the hands of common warriors. This shift mirrors the sea people's own mode of existence. They were not defined by palaces or monumental capitals. They were defined by mobility, adaptability, and shared risk. In a strange way, the post-collapse world began to resemble them more than it resembled the empires they had helped dismantle. Yet despite their influence, the sea peoples themselves were never remembered as founders. Why? Because history is written by those who rebuild states, not by those who break them apart. They trace their origins to gods, heroes, or ancient promises, not to desperate migrations, born of famine and collapse. And so the sea peoples became shadows. But archaeology has a way of restoring shadows to substance. Excavations across the Mediterranean reveal abrupt cultural shifts that align too closely to be coincidence. Pottery styles jump across seas. Burial practices change overnight. Fortifications appear where none existed before. These are not gradual evolutions. They are signatures of movement, people arriving suddenly, bringing habits shaped elsewhere. In some regions, we even see hybrid cultures emerge within a single generation. Old gods are worshipped alongside new ones. Foreign symbols appear in local temples. Languages borrow words from distant shores. This blending tells us something essential. The sea peoples did not simply replace populations. They merged with them. This merging challenges the older image of total annihilation. While many cities were burned, many people survived. They adapted to new neighbors, new threats, and new realities. The sea peoples were not a wave that washed everything away. They were a current that reshaped the shoreline. And still, the question of origin refuses to settle. Modern scholars have proposed countless identifications. The Danien may be linked to the Danaans of Greek tradition. The Shurden may have connections to Sardinia, where later warriors wore similar horned helmets. The Shekelesh have been tentatively associated with Sicily. None of these identifications are certain. All remain debated. But perhaps certainty is the wrong expectation. The sea peoples may never have had a single point of origin, because they were already a mixture before they ever set sail. Centuries of trade, intermarriage, mercenary service, and cultural exchange had blurred ethnic lines long before collapse forced movement. When the system broke, these blended communities moved together. They were already multicultural. This realization reframes the sea peoples not as outsiders invading civilization, but as insiders cast adrift when civilization failed. They were the surplus population of a globalized Bronze Age world that could no longer sustain itself. And this is where their story becomes uncomfortably modern. A highly interconnected system, dependent on long supply chains, vulnerable to climate stress, rigid political hierarchies, extreme inequality between elites and laborers. These were not unique to the late Bronze Age. When such systems falter, movement follows. Migration is not a cause of collapse. It is a response to it. The sea peoples were not the spark. They were the wildfire, carried by winds, already blowing. Even Egypt's survival fits this pattern. Egypt endured because of geography, the Nile provided food stability, and because of administrative flexibility. But even Egypt turned inward afterward. Its imperial age ended. Its confidence diminished. The memory of the sea peoples lingered like a scar. Centuries later, Egyptian scribes still recorded them as a warning. Chaos from the sea. Order under threat. A reminder of how close the world had come to unraveling completely. And yet, it did not end. Human societies adapted. They simplified. They decentralized. They endured. Which leads us to the final, unsettling truth about the sea peoples. They were not an anomaly. They were a phase, a recurring one. Throughout history, when complex systems overextend, when climate shifts faster than institutions can respond, when inequality deepens and resilience weakens, people move, borders harden, conflicts erupt. Narratives form that paint the displaced as destroyers rather than survivors. The sea peoples were simply among the first to be remembered this way. They remind us that collapse does not arrive with a single villain. It arrives through pressure, accumulation, and denial. And when it finally breaks, history often names the moving people, not the broken system, as the threat. So when we ask, who were the sea peoples, we are asking more than a historical question. We are asking how civilizations fail. They were not ghosts from the deep. They were humans, caught in the undertow of history. And in their movement, they reshaped the world forever. There is still one more layer to peel back, because even after centuries of study, the sea peoples continue to resist closure. Their story does not end neatly with settlement, assimilation, or disappearance. Instead, it lingers fragmented, unresolved, much like the world they passed through. To truly grasp them, we must confront an uncomfortable idea, that the sea peoples may not have seen themselves as anything special at all. They likely did not share a single name for themselves. They did not march under a common flag. They did not believe they were ending an age. To them, each journey was probably personal. A village fleeing hunger, a band of warriors seeking employment, a family escaping violence, a ship leaving a coast that could no longer sustain it. History compressed these countless individual decisions into a single label because empires prefer simplicity when naming chaos. The Egyptian term that becomes sea peoples was not an ethnic definition. It was a directional one. It meant danger from the sea. That is all. This is why Egyptian records emphasize fear more than understanding. Pharaohs did not ask who these people were. They asked how to stop them. Their inscriptions are defensive, reactive, and self-glorifying. Victory texts exist because survival needed justification. A god-king could not simply admit that the world was changing beyond his control, but beyond Egypt's walls. There were places with no monuments left to speak. In central Anatolia, the heartland of the Hittite Empire fell silent. Administrative centers vanished. Writing disappeared almost overnight. Entire regions returned to pastoral life. For generations, no one recorded what happened. The sea peoples may have passed through these lands, or they may have been one of many forces tearing them apart. The result was the same: memory erased. In the Aegean, palaces fell, but people did not disappear. They regrouped in smaller communities. They passed stories orally, reshaping history into myth. Gods became more distant. Heroes became more human. The world was no longer ordered by palace bureaucracy, but by kinship and survival. This shift in worldview is one of the sea people's most profound indirect legacies. The Bronze Age believed in stability in cosmic order maintained by kings, rituals, and trade. The post-collapse world accepted instability as normal. This acceptance shaped the religions, politics, and philosophies that followed. It produced societies that expected hardship and valued adaptability over permanence. In this sense, the sea peoples marked the end of innocence, not innocence in morality, but innocence in expectation, the belief that civilization, once built, would endure. And still, for all this upheaval, something remarkable happened. The Mediterranean did not become empty. It became connected again slowly, differently, and more resiliently. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, maritime trade revived. Phoenician sailors crossed vast distances. Greek communities began colonizing coastlines. Iron tools spread. Alphabets replaced complex writing systems, making literacy more accessible. The world rebuilt itself not as a fragile elite network, but as a patchwork of interacting cultures. The Sea Peoples stood at the doorway between these two worlds. They were the last actors of the Bronze Age drama and the first shadows of the Iron Age stage. They belonged fully to neither. That is why they feel elusive. Transitional peoples rarely leave clear footprints. They exist in motion, not in monuments. Modern science has added new dimensions to this mystery. Isotopic analysis of skeletons shows that many individuals buried in post-collapse layers were not local to the regions where they died. DNA studies suggest population mixing rather than replacement. These findings reinforce what archaeology has long implied: the Sea Peoples were not an invading race, but a convergence of displaced lives. And yet, popular imagination still clings to the image of invaders from the sea. Why? Because the idea of an external enemy is comforting. It allows civilizations to believe that collapse comes from outside, not from internal weakness. It turns complex failures into simple stories. It transforms suffering into blame. The Sea Peoples became history's convenient face for disaster. But when we strip away fear, propaganda, and distance, what remains is profoundly human. Parents carrying children onto ships, farmers turning into fighters, sailors navigating unfamiliar coasts, communities choosing movement over starvation. This is not the story of barbarians ending civilization. It is the story of civilization failing its people. And that may be the most enduring reason the Sea Peoples still haunt us. Because their story is not confined to the ancient past. It reappears whenever systems stretch too far, whenever climate destabilizes economies, whenever elites insulate themselves while the margins collapse. The names change, the routes change, the technology changes. The pattern does not. The Sea Peoples remind us that history is not only shaped by kings and empires, but by ordinary people responding to extraordinary pressure. When enough people are forced to move at once, the world shifts beneath their feet and beneath everyone else's. So when we finally ask one last time, who were the Sea Peoples? End quote. The most honest answer may be this: they were not a mystery force from beyond civilization. They were the sound of history breaking and reforming, and in that breaking, they ensured that the world would never be the same again. The Sea Peoples were never a single nation, a unified army, or a shadowy civilization lost to time. They were a moment, a convergence of pressure, movement, and survival at the breaking point of the ancient world. Born from drought, economic collapse, political rigidity, and environmental strain, they emerged when the systems of the late Bronze Age could no longer sustain the people who depended on them. They did not set out to end an era, yet their movement accelerated the fall of empires that believed themselves eternal. Cities burned, trade networks shattered, and writing itself disappeared in whole regions. But what followed was not the end of humanity or culture, it was transformation. From the wreckage of the Bronze Age arose new societies, new technologies, and new ways of organizing power. The world became less centralized, more adaptable, and ultimately more resilient. The Sea Peoples were not destroyers standing outside civilization. They were its displaced children, shaped by the very systems that failed them. Remembered as invaders because history is written by those who rebuild states, they became symbols of chaos rather than witnesses to collapse. Yet archaeology and silence alike reveal a deeper truth. They settled, adapted, merged, and endured. Their legacy is not found in monuments or royal inscriptions, but in the shift of history itself. They marked the point where stability gave way to motion, where empires gave way to communities, and where survival mattered more than tradition. In the end, the Sea Peoples force us to confront an enduring reality. Civilizations do not fall because people move. People move because civilizations are already falling. When the foundations crack, humanity does what it has always done. It migrates, it adapts, and it reshapes the world. The Sea Peoples were not the end of history. They were the beginning of the world that followed. If this story reshaped how you see ancient history, stay with us. Like the video to support deep, long-form documentaries that go beyond myths and surface narratives. Subscribe for more immersive journeys into lost civilizations, forgotten peoples, and the hidden forces that changed the ancient world. Share this documentary with anyone who loves history or questions how civilizations rise and fall. And tell us in the comments, were the sea peoples invaders or survivors of a collapsing world? Your insight keeps history alive.